Well, we're getting bits and pieces of the Passion from Mark. And I've often wondered about this. This describes what Caiaphas, the high priest, does while interrogating Jesus. And tearing his tunics, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses?" But I've often wondered if that related to this. This is from Leviticus. In fact, there's a couple places in Leviticus in the Old Testament where rules and laws are given to the priests. Look at the part in blue up here on the right. The priest who is highest among his brothers, who has had the anointing oil poured on his head and has been ordained to wear the priestly garments, must not let his hair hang loose or tear his garments. And then down here, then Moses said to Aaron, this is from elsewhere in Leviticus, said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, in other words, the priests, the Jewish priests, "Do not let your hair become disheveled and do not tear your garments, or else you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole congregation," and so forth. Now, so I have wondered, when Caiaphas does this and tears his garments publicly while interrogating Jesus as a sign of his remorse, people would tear their garments, throw ashes on their heads. This would be a sign of public grief. Is he violating ordinances for the priesthood as given by Moses as part of the Mosaic law? Is he himself performing a kind of blasphemy? Well, apparently it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because if you go to Bible Hub and you look up some of the commentaries on this verse, let's look at the pulpit commentary down here on the right. And he compares this also to St. Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, we have the same thing described. The Greek verb here rendered rent or torn implies violent dramatic action. The Jewish tunic was open under the chin and large enough to receive the head so that it could easily be placed over the shoulders by inserting the head. When the wearer wished to give this sign of indignation or grief, he would seize the garment at this opening with both hands and violently tear it asunder down to the waist. But it was unlawful for the high priest to do this in a private grief. And they give a citation of Leviticus 10:6. That's one of the readings that I just showed you. Some of the fathers think that by this action, Caiaphas, the high priest, involuntarily typified the rending of the priesthood from himself and from the Jewish nation. That's interesting. So this being a public grief, apparently it was acceptable for Caiaphas to do this as a show of horror at what he considered the blasphemy of Jesus. But it's still interesting to me that a high priest was not supposed to tear his garments, and yet he does so as a show of public grief. And yet, as they point out there in the pulpit commentary, there are some commentators who say, well, this represented the tearing of the priesthood away from the Jewish nation, and the priesthood then becomes another kind of thing and passes on to the church, and is not merely composed of the tribe of Levi, which it was in Jesus' day and prior. So this is stuff you can dig up, and stuff that I learned just by doing a little bit of research, especially on Bible Hub, which is really good for individual verses, as I've said before. I also wanted to ask you what you make of the fact from Hosea, and I'll do this quickly. I haven't looked this up on Bible Hub. You guys can if you want to. But it's this passage in Hosea. "Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us." Again, we have the image of tearing. "He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. In the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight." Now, is this just a coincidence? Is it a symbol? Was there a typical symbol? But of course, you can tie this into the resurrection. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up as a nation. At any rate, it's part of the interweaving. Even though the Bible consists of different books that have been gathered together by editors, nonetheless, they are all interwoven because they are ultimately telling the same story, the story of the spiritual encounter, an encounter with a reality that has played itself out over millennia and continues to. So, at any rate, if you're confused, do a little research on your own, like I did. That's how you'll find the answers to things, even if the answers are a little bit ambiguous, as this one was.